substance, paranoia. Jim Jordan is one of those people, zero substance, extreme paranoia. He is, I don't know what he's scared about, but he wastes an awful lot of time and money having these hearings, which achieves nothing really to change your life. It may achieve a lot to cable news and those on blue tick Twitter to have some talking points, and that's all it is. This is a political opportunity for him to, well, probably find a way of bashing the current administration over the bonds to help form die. If you could see anything else, please let me know, because I'm totally clueless. I mean, today's hearing on the weaponization of... You tell me.
No, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to answer questions regarding the events that occurred at the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021. I would like to tell you that I've forgotten some of the events of that day, or that my recollection is not as clear as it once was. But that would not be the truth. The events of January 6th are as vivid to me now as when they occurred over 3 years ago. While the physical scars of that day have healed, the emotional scars remain. We are a government of laws, not of men. I spent nearly 2 decades as a law enforcement officer trying to enforce the law. My career began in the United States Capitol as a Capitol Police officer and ended when called upon as a Metropolitan Police officer to protect the Capitol against a mob of people. While much of my career involved dangerous encounters with violent criminals, that experience was unlike anything I had experienced. I'm here to tell you what happened to me on that day and what I saw and heard happening to fellow officers. As for me, I was violently grabbed, restrained, beaten, tased, all while being called a traitor to my country. I was at risk of being stripped of and killed with my own firearm as I heard chants of kill him with his own gun. My body camera video captured the violence of the crowd directed towards me during those very brutal moments. The portions of the video I have seen remain extremely painful for me to watch, but doing so is crucial to fully understand what really happened that day and the extent of the violence. During those moments, I remember thinking that there was a good chance that I could be killed, and my thoughts were of my children who may lose their father. While I'm here to share my experience, I know that hundreds of other law enforcement officers responded that day. They were outnumbered and acted with tremendous bravery to protect the Capitol and all those present inside who serve our country. Those officers have sustained injuries, both physical and emotional. They too have been scarred, some visible and some that cannot be seen. I think of them often, like my partner, Jimmy Albright, who dragged me to safety while I was unconscious and who drove me to the emergency room, though injured himself. I think then about Commander Ramey Kyle, who, like so many of us, self-deployed to the Capitol, who organized the defense of the Lower West Terrace Tunnel. His rally cry, "Do not give up the door," echoes through my thoughts. I think of all the brave men and women, newly minted officers, and those nearly retired who responded to the call of service that day in defense of our nation. Those who are still on the front lines each and every day to make our city safe and protect our institutions of government. I appear today not to give my opinion or analysis or advocate for some action, but simply to bear witness. I leave whatever actions to be taken to your wisdom and where we go as a nation to the American people. I have no agenda or affiliation. I do not come with malice in my heart, but only a deep love of this country, which I know is shared by so many others, both young and old, both Republican and Democrat. And in the process of speaking, more importantly, listening to each other, hopefully we can come together as one nation with shared values of wanting tomorrow to be better than today, with the hope and confidence that we do each and every day, is for the singular purpose of trying to provide a better life for our children and our children's children in generations to come. I thank you for your invitation to be here today and the opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you, Mr. Fanone. We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fanone, I want to express my heartfelt thank you for being here today. Those of us who were here on January 6th, in no small part, owe you and others a debt of gratitude for the work you did, ushering people into, members of Congress and others into safety. And I truly appreciate that, and thank you.
Thank you, sir.
If this were only about January 6th, that would have been my last comment, and we'd be done. I'm going to ask a series of questions that I think beg the question of something beyond January 6th. For all of you, if you'd raise your hand, are there any of you who think that it would be better if we had the same rules of discovery that China, Cuba, Russia, Iran have from a standpoint of looking for criminals among us? Is there anyone here that would raise their hand? I thought not. For all of you, let's ask some questions, and I'll use Mr. Tedesco as my straw man for a moment. With the way the Bank Secrecy Act has been used, is there anything that stops an administration from choosing to look at and gather, strip away and get from the major banks or all the banks, all the data of all the citizens and participants in our society? In other words, simply haul it all in so they have a database for whatever they need to do, whether it's January 6th or, somebody driving in town and not paying a parking ticket.
Sure. I don't know the Bank Secrecy Act particularly well. I know the First Amendment implications of the way in which
I'm really looking at the Fourth Amendment for a moment.
Sure.
Again, for the others, Mr. Knight, I think you answered on this. Really, there's nothing that would stop an administration in secret from taking vast amounts, potentially all of it, under current law. The only question you'd really ask is, can you later go to court and say it was excessive, and would the court side with you? But from a functional standpoint, what they ask for at the FBI, they get. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, Representative. In fact, I think it's even worse than that, in the sense that it doesn't necessarily need to be evidence of a crime. It could be evidence of some other violation, a non-criminal violation. And also, because the target of a suspicious activity report is prohibited from finding out, it would actually be very hard for the person to go to court later and challenge it unless they were the subject potentially of a prosecution, in which case you're already starting behind the 8 ball.
Okay, so as we stand right now, the Fourth Amendment relative to your banking records, which don't just say what you spent money on, it says where you were. Because by definition, when you put that credit card into the gas pump, we know exactly where you were. So there's nothing that stops government from finding out not only what you're spending on, but where you are and what you're doing. Is that correct?
Sir, that's absolutely correct. And the reason for that is, from the court's perspective, those records aren't yours. They belong to the bank, and therefore you have no protectable privacy right in them. But the court recently has been starting to change their thinking on that type of thing.
Well, and we're hoping to spur the court to think more through legislation. Summarizing, though, we're talking mostly about bank records because those are the ones that we have a current example. But isn't it true that the FBI and other agencies want the same access to all of your phone records, which would include where you are moment by moment and who you talk to? Is that correct?
Well, yes, that was an issue in the Carpenter case, where law enforcement tried to pull location data from cell phone towers, and the court found that customers have a protectable Fourth Amendment right, even though those records belong to the phone company, not to the customer.
So, in closing, for everyone here, if I want to get those kinds of records on the FBI, in the case of your phone records, for all practical purposes, there are exigent circumstance exceptions, but for all practical purposes, you need to get a warrant. You don't need it for bank records, but isn't it true that those records very often provide the same information, and thus are equally invasive into not just your First Amendment, your Fourth Amendment, reasonable expectation for privacy and the keeping of your files and personal effects?
I would argue they're potentially more sensitive and can provide more accurate information than cell phone towers.
Well, I, for one, would close by saying that I don't see a problem getting warrants. I don't see a problem getting judges, and this committee has a significant role with FISA and other cases like that. The question is, will we amend law so that no matter where the data is being grabbed by the government, it's being grabbed pursuant to a reasonable expectation that you have a reason to get it and a judge who agrees. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for their willingness to testify before the committee. As evidenced by today's hearing, the singular mission of this so-called subcommittee on weaponization and the House Republican leadership appears to be the proliferation, or ironically, the weaponization of false narratives for political purposes. Combined with the rudderless efforts to develop evidence for the impeachment of President Biden, these proceedings have become increasingly bizarre at every turn. You know, once upon a time, we were told that the key to all of this was the Hunter Biden laptop. That was the smoking gun that would solve all of this. Until then, it wasn't. Then it was getting Hunter Biden to testify. That was going to be the conclusive evidence. Until at one point he had the courage to walk into a hearing, sit in the front row, and then all of a sudden Republicans rejected his offer to testify publicly and instead voted to hold him in contempt. Then it was going to be the testimony of the Republicans' top legal expert witnesses who were going to appear before Congress and offer evidence against President Biden and lay out the legal theory to justify articles of impeachment. But they showed up, all of them with great resumes, but with no evidence. And they testified under oath, that they could not find any evidence that would support or suggest such charges. And finally, last month, the Trump-appointed special counsel, David Weiss, announced that he had indicted Chairman Jim Jordan's star witness, former FBI informant Alexander Smirnov, for making false statements and fabricating evidence to federal investigators about President Biden and his family, including the shameless lie that President Biden sought millions in bribes from Ukrainian energy company Burisma when he served as vice president. Now, Smirnov, some of you may not remember, but Smirnov is the guy that Chairman Jordan described, and I'll give you a quote, the chairman's quote, as providing, quote, the most corroborating evidence the Republicans have, close quote, in support of impeachment. So given that Smirnov is being charged by the Republican Trump-appointed special counsel for lying and fabricating evidence, and the pathetic show that the Republicans have put on so far, that assessment is probably correct. He's probably the best they've got. Now the chairman of this subcommittee is determined to obscure the facts surrounding January 6th. Today's hearing appears to be based on the false narrative that conservative Americans and even Bible purchasers are the targets of pervasive and baseless financial surveillance by the federal government. It also follows statements made by several House members downplaying the attacks that Officer Fanone has described at the U.S. Capitol complex as, quote, acts of vandalism, close quote, and a normal tourist visit. That could not be further from the truth. As reported by the Bipartisan Select Committee on January 6th in its final report, our nation endured an insurrection that specifically sought to violently block congressional certification of the 2020 presidential election. The sheer scale of the mob violence that you saw on the video earlier and the lawlessness that was exhibited that day tested the very fabric of our democracy, with rioters savagely beating law enforcement officers like Officer Fanone amid repeated crowd chants such as hang Mike Pence, shoot him with his own gun. The Republican vice president, hang Mike Pence. That's what makes you an extremist. That's what makes you a terrorist. Not not just your desire to purchase under the Second Amendment a weapon that you're legally entitled to have. It also warranted additional investigatory efforts by federal law enforcement authorities to prevent more violence leading up to the 2021 presidential inauguration. Officer Fanone, as a former Metropolitan Police officer, could you please tell us how the promulgation of false narratives, like this was just a tourist visit or simple vandalism, how that distorted description affects your ability to do your job?
Thank you for the question. Well, essentially, the distortions, mischaracterizations, and lies about January 6th resulted in, or at least partially played a role in me leaving my job as a Metropolitan Police officer. They have inspired fellow Americans to threaten me, threaten members of my family, simply because of the statements that I've made about my experience both on January 6, 2021 and in the aftermath.
Well, thank you very much. My time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous
Mr.
consent request.
Fanone, I would thank you for your service.
Gentleman yields back.
Unanimous consent request, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady may state her request.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a January 7th, 2021 email from the FBI to financial institutions requesting information about Edward Florea because he, quote, claimed to be armed and intending to travel to D.C. to unleash, quote, some violence. I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a press release from the Eastern District of New York announcing Edward Florea's sentencing for making threats to kill elected officials like Senator Raphael Warnock, entitled, quote, Queens man sentenced to 33 months in prison for posting threats to kill a member of Congress and illegally possessing ammunition, unquote.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's just sitting up here listening to y'all's testimony. It's just absolutely insane, the level of the deep state acting to go after pro-life groups, pro-gun groups that you, Mr. Tedesco, taught, the Arkansas pro-life group that now they can't even bank at the bank that they were banking at because of their political beliefs. The information that the chairman put up about people purchasing religious texts and firearms, all without a warrant. I mean, you know, you go to law school and they teach you constitutional law and the Fourth Amendment and all these things that have to happen in order for the government to get information about you or to search your information. And all of this is happening without even the person knowing that it's going on, without a warrant, without an ability to even to defend themselves. In the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, at the U.S. Department of Treasury told major banks to be on the lookout for customers using credit and debit cards for the purchase of legal firearms. As a gun owner and a strong proponent of our Second Amendment rights, it's appalling that a federal agency would ask private companies to spy on their customers conducting perfectly legal business transactions. It's not like there's a suspicion of criminality going on. These are just typical purchases of firearms. FinCEN also passed along a report to several large banks titled Bankrolling Bigotry, an overview of the online funding strategies of American hate groups. Included among those supposed hate groups is the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is represented before us today by Mr. Tedesco. I found this characterization curious because the ADF that I know is anything but a hate group. ADF defends Americans' God-given right to religious liberty in courts around this country, but it seems the Biden administration views advocacy for religious liberty as hate these days. That says far more about the administration than it does about ADF. President Obama once infamously remarked that many conservative Americans cling to guns or religion, and given FinCEN's actions, it seems that President Biden's administration shares the same hostility for millions of Americans like me who proudly cling to our First and Second Amendment rights. Mr. Tedesco, what's your reaction to your organization being identified as a hate group in a report shared by a government agency?
It's unbelievable that that is being used by the federal government to advise banks on domestic terrorist threats. But you know, I think the bigger point here is that the concept of hate is a tool of suppression. And on top of that, that kind of language, hate speech and similar kinds of vague concepts are permeated throughout the financial industry and are used to shut down events and to debank people. JP Morgan Chase has used it several times. Arkansas Family Policy, they said was high risk. They shut down an event by Defense of Liberty. On behalf, Donald Trump Jr. was speaking at it. They shut down that event on the basis of a hate policy. So we know these policies are being weaponized in the financial industry. And again, because of the Bank Secrecy Act and a lot of the shrouding of the way regulation happens in the banking context, it's really hard to know why are these things happening. We just know it's on the rise, and it's a real concern.
Well, and one of my colleagues was just saying that this is just a narrative that we're creating, a political narrative, but you've gone through specifics. If you want to highlight specifically some of these instances that you're referring to of facts where pro-life groups or organizations that are conservative have been debanked by these private entities.
Sure, the highest profile one is a former member of the Senate, Samuel Brownback's organization, National Committee for Religious Freedom. JP Morgan Chase canceled that account in 2022. They gave an escalating and very different reasons that were contradictory over the next year as scrutiny mounted. None of the reasons ever held any weight. Interestingly enough, they referred to anti-money laundering, financing of terrorism, a concept called politically exposed persons. All of these are within the banking regulations, and I think are used as tools ultimately to suppress people because of their views. Again, the secrecy and the shrouding of the reasons for the decisions is a huge part of the problem, and I think that's something Congress needs to address.
And is there circumstances in which the consumers may never know that their information was privately disclosed from the bank to the FBI or a government agency?
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge part of the problem is our clients, to a person, anytime they go to the bank, once they get debanked, it's always under some vague policy. The only thing the bank will say is high risk or business type or risk tolerance. Every time they go back and ask for an answer, a specific reason, the bank just stonewalls them. And so they can't get access to the information.
I only have a couple seconds left. So what is your recourse if you do find out? So let's say, because I basically ticked a lot of those boxes that were referenced, firearms, Bibles, religious texts. So if you do find out that your information was divulged from the bank that you bank to a government agency, do you have any recourse whatsoever to go after the government or the bank?
It's difficult for consumers who are in that position because they usually don't know it happens. If it happens, there are consumer complaints you can file with state attorneys general. There's probably other avenues that people could pursue, but I think that's part of the reason why Congress should act to cordon off some of the secrecy and confidentiality that's happening in the banking industry, and also affirmatively require banks to stop using reputational risk and some of these other vague categories to determine whether they're going to bank with someone.
Thank you all for being here today.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request. I thank the chair. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the FBI's situation report sent to financial institutions with respect to an explicit and clear threat on January 16th, 2021, with respect to the inauguration. I thank the chair.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you. I thank our witnesses for being here, and I want to examine some of the actual requests that the FBI sent to financial institutions in the wake of the violence that occurred on January 6, 2021. Not the overly broad groups that my Republican colleagues are purposely trying to scare Americans into believing that are being surveilled every single day without any crime prevention or crime-solving purpose in mind. On January 14, 2021, the FBI asked financial institutions for information about Robert Corey Lemke, who made, quote, interstate threats of violence targeting the family of a U.S. congressman, as well as other in furtherance of anti-government, anti-authority extremism. And I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the email dated January 14, 2021 from FBI employee to financial institutions into the record. Lemke ultimately pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 3 years in prison for making threatening interstate communications against members of Congress and journalists in connection with the 2020 election. He sent threatening electronic and audio messages to approximately 50 victims he targeted because of their statements about Donald Trump losing the 2020 presidential election. He sent messages to a New York City congressman's brother threatening him and the brother's children. He sent messages to the family of a journalist, and I would ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the press release entitled "California Man Sentenced to 3 Years in Prison for Making Threats Against Political Officials and Journalists Relating to the Outcome of the 2020 Presidential Election."
Without objection.
Officer Fanone, in your experience, is it appropriate for law enforcement to use all lawfully available tools in the investigation of somebody who's threatening the family of members of public officials or journalists?
Yes, ma'am. It's not only appropriate, it's law enforcement's responsibility to do so.
Would it be a dereliction of duty if you didn't use every lawfully available tool to you to try to prevent a crime from happening or to solve a crime that has already happened?
Yes, ma'am, I believe so.
Thank you. The day before the inauguration, the FBI requested information about Samuel Fisher, who was photographed on the steps of the U.S. Capitol and is suspected of unlawfully entering federal property on January 6, 2021. The FBI noted that Fisher may also have been, quote, manufacturing, trafficking guns in preparation for civil war. Additionally, Fisher espouses racially motivated and anti-government extremist ideology, end quote. The FBI noted that it was, quote, currently preparing enforcement action and is interested in financial information that corroborates Fisher's involvement in firearms tracking. And I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the email from FBI employee to financial institutions about this matter into the record.
Without objection.
Officer Fanone, why might law enforcement agencies seek financial information in cases of arms trafficking?
Well, I mean, outside of the obvious that potential receipts or purchases made would provide evidence that, in fact, the weapons were purchased by a specific individual. My understanding is, within these particular requests, it was the FBI seeking voluntary compliance from a number of banking institutions in which their ask was very specific in that they were looking for individuals who were present on January 6th, which I think we can all agree was an incredibly violent assault against law enforcement officers. Those individuals that also had purchased firearms within the past 6 months and or at least there was evidence to support they were planning on returning to the nation's capital on January 20th.
So they weren't just looking for people based on their beliefs. There were 3 different criteria that they were using that all had to be present in order to do this search. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Great. Samuel Fisher, by the way, was arrested the very next day. And when he was arrested, FBI agents found over 1,000 rounds of ammunition and several weapons, including an illegally modified AR-15 rifle and machetes in his Upper East Side apartment and his car. Fisher, by the way, wrote after the Capitol riot, quote, seeing cops literally run was the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life, end quote. And I would ask unanimous consent to insert into the record that New York Times article entitled Dating Coach Charged in Capitol Riot Gets Prison Term for Gun Crime into the record. This is a clear example of people committing criminal acts that my colleagues across the aisle are claiming are the victims, the innocent victims of surveillance. But in reality, the FBI was doing their job. They were working to prevent threats to the inauguration and to hold January 6th rioters responsible for their criminal actions. Officer Fanone, I want to thank you for being here today, and I appreciate your willingness to bear witness to what really happened on January 6, 2021, and just to dispel these overly broad, fear-mongering tactics that innocent Americans are being surveilled simply because of their beliefs or their religion. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes.
Yield to Mr. Jordan.
I think jump for you. Mr. Knight, do you need a gun registration list if government can just go ask the banks every time some customer purchases a gun?
Well, the banks won't know if you purchased a gun per se, but your bank records can be a pretty good, though not perfect, registration for almost anything.
But my point is it's almost like a backdoor registration, right?
Yes, one of the challenges is that highly sensitive information can be accessed through financial records that otherwise is constitutionally protected.
Yeah. Dr. Peterson, do you think they're just going to stop with conservatives? I mean, my history tells us that the cancel culture mob, the the surveillance state, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't just, they never are satisfied with just certain people. It always expands. And I'll give you an example. A few years ago, Senator Feinstein, iconic Democrat senator from the great state of California, the folks in San Francisco renamed the Dianne Feinstein Elementary School. They took her name off the school because they found that she said something like 40 years ago that the cancel culture mob didn't like. So even a liberal Democrat senator wasn't good enough for the mob. They came after her too. And this is the thing that scares me. We've invited probably more Democrat witnesses in front of this committee than any other committee, because we invite Democrats to come in and say we respect the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, respect the Constitution. My concern is it never just stops with certain people. It always goes further. Do you agree with that?
Well, the reason I prefaced my remarks with an insistence on nonpartisanship is because the danger posed by this increasing ability of governments and large corporations to collude threatens everyone's freedom equally. And it could well be that at the moment, and this is, I think, the case the Republicans here are trying to make, is that the people who are in the sights of that collusion tend to have more conservative leanings, but that will shift in a moment whenever the political tides shift. And we're concentrating in this hearing a fair bit on the specific events of January 6th, a very partisan issue that produces a very intense partisan divide, but we're not addressing the fundamental issue here directly, which is that our new technology enables a mode of surveillance that's so intense and all-pervading that no one will escape its purview regardless of their political views.
No, I think that's exactly right. And there also seems to me, and I'll go to Mr. Tedesco, there seems to be a pattern emerging. I'm going to take you back to when we first kind of started getting into this issue with the somewhat famous now school board's memorandum from the Department of Justice. And I know you probably remember what I'm talking about here, Mr. Tedesco. But the opening sentence of the Attorney General's document, this memorandum, says, in recent months, there's been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, threats of violence against school administrators, board members, teachers, staff who participate in the vital work of running our nation's public schools. At the hearing where we had the Attorney General, I asked him a simple question. I said, you make that opening statement as the basis for why you need this memorandum to go after moms and dads showing up at school board meetings. What was that first sentence based on? And he told us it was based on the National School Boards Association, the memorandum they put out. And the same thing happened to you guys, because we had some entity here called the Global Disinformation Index puts out this information, and then the government uses that information as the basis to say you're some terrorist group. That is frightening. That our government, because FinCEN, the Treasury Department, used what some agency put out, or not agency, some entity put out as the basis to say you guys are some hate group or some terrorist group. Yep. I find that alarming, and particularly the pattern that it, I guess two doesn't make a pattern, but it sure makes you start to wonder. Your thoughts, Mr. Tedesco?
Sure. The FBI used the SPLC's report on radical traditional Catholics to target them as well in the interim between the Moms for Liberty and parental rights groups and what's going on today. I think it's very alarming that the government uses these obviously partisan and discredited third-party, arbiters of truth who really are just promoting their own political agenda and trying to do damage to their perceived political enemies, to make decisions about anything, let alone sending them to financial institutions as part of some kind of financial surveillance scheme. Yeah.
Some left-wing group says you're bad. Oh, then the government's going to use that information to send out to banks and say, you might want to be concerned about this. You maybe want to debank these individuals. That is a frightening world. And the point is, I don't think it's going to be just limited to conservative people in the future. Because we've already seen examples. There were people in Black Lives Matter who got targeted during the summer of 2020 when all the protests were happening around the country. And I disagree with some of the things, a lot of the things that happened that summer, but I also don't like the fact that they're going after liberals either. That's a scary thing. And then there used to be an agreement in both parties that First Amendment activity should be protected. Second Amendment activity, your right to privacy should be protected. But unfortunately now it's gotten way too partisan. With that, we will go to the other side. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For nearly 20 years in this chamber, I know I've heard time and again Republicans claim that they backed the blue. Just recently, Chairman Jordan put out a press release around the Law Enforcement Appreciation Day resolution, which said, when it comes to supporting the police, quote, Republicans put words into action, unquote. Yet when it comes to walking that walk, Republicans too often take a seat. Just yesterday, we took a vote on a bipartisan spending bill that includes funding for our criminal justice programs. Of the Republicans that make up this committee, a handful of you voted against it. That, of course, would mean less funding for state and local law enforcement agencies and more criminals on our streets and in our neighborhoods. That no vote means no funding for the Internet Crimes Against Children program, a key law enforcement tool that keeps online predators away from our children. Those actions sure don't back the blue, and now today, Republicans want to target law enforcement yet again. This time, they purposefully downplay the heinous violence that injured and traumatized hundreds of Capitol Police officers in the January 6th insurrection, perhaps the most infamous assault on law enforcement in recent American history. Specifically, our Republican colleagues are taking aim at the ability to use financial records as a tool to prosecute the coup plotters, the criminals who attempted to stop the legitimate constitutional transfer of power in Congress. These are the very financial tools that help hold to account the people who tried to overthrow a presidential election. Officer Fanone, thank you so much for repeatedly testifying about your experiences. I'm sure it isn't easy, as you mentioned, to relive these traumatic moments. Could you describe some of the violence briefly that Capitol Police officers were subjected to on January 6th?
Certainly. So I, like many other officers from the Metropolitan Police Department, self-deployed that day in that I heard distress calls coming out from officers who were already deployed at the Capitol complex and took it upon myself to respond to those calls for assistance. When I arrived at the Capitol, I made my way to what's referred to as the Lower West Terrace Tunnel in response to a specific distress call coming from officers that were defending that tunnel against a large group of violent rioters that were trying to gain access.
Thank you.
When I entered the tunnel, I observed about 40 or 50 DC police officers and a few U.S. Capitol Police officers attempting to hold back the violent mob. The officers were being assaulted with a variety of different weapons, everything from metal poles, 2x4s, aluminum baseball bats, batons, and other police equipment that had been stripped from police officers themselves were then used against officers.
Thank you, Officer Fanone. Thank you. I'm sorry, I want to just make sure I can get some other items in. The video that we saw earlier was disturbing. In a video that I don't have time to show, you can hear words like traitor being yelled at police officers and shouts like F the blue. 5 police officers who served at the Capitol died in the aftermath of the insurrection. Officer Fanone, what's your response to those who say that no police officers were killed by the events on January 6, 2021?
Well, my thoughts on Officer Brian Sicknick. Obviously, Brian Sicknick's cause of death was ruled unrelated to the Capitol riot. That being said, I think that good, decent people would understand that if it were not for his participation in the defense of this Capitol on January 6th against a violent mob, Brian Sicknick would be here with us today. I understand, I think better than most, the post-traumatic stress that accompanied my participation in defending the Capitol on January 6th, and then enduring the mischaracterization or lies about what I experienced that day from people in positions of power, many of whom were here at the Capitol themselves. I understand what brought many officers to taking their own lives, and I certainly attribute their actions to their participation in defense of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and my Republican colleagues, once again, I ask that you stop trivializing the violent assault the entire world saw that day, both to our democracy and to our law enforcement. And please do not cavalierly discard financial information as a law enforcement tool to prevent the next January 6th. The necessity of making this tool for law enforcement is even more imperative considering the presidential candidate you support all but promises yet another assault, violent or otherwise, on our sacred democracy. And I yield back.
Gentlelady
Mr. Chairman, before you go to the next member, if I can ask again for a unanimous consent request.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the FBI's situation report sent to financial institutions on January 13, 2021, which explains in the middle of page 2 the exact kind of threats that the FBI was trying to prevent leading up to the inauguration that day. These were threats to murder members of Congress and start a shooting at the inauguration, the exact type of threats the FBI is responsible for investigating. And I quote, on 8 January, information was received regarding a video posted on an identified